Las Vegas has a way of pretending that nothing ever truly begins there. Everything arrives already in motion. Lights blinking mid-sentence. Slot machines chiming as if they've been talking long, before anyone listened. So when they checked into the hotel that afternoon, it didn't feel like the start of a story. It felt like an interruption in one already happening. A pause. A breath taken between long stretches of noise. The lobby smelled faintly of recycled air and something sweet. Cleaner, maybe, or perfume that had soaked into the carpet years earlier and never quite left. The front desk clerk smiled the way people do, when they've smiled 1,000 times already that day. Polite, automatic, forgettable. Names were exchanged, keys slid across polished wood, and a room number was spoken aloud without ceremony. No one lingered on it. No one ever does. Their luggage rolled behind them, wheels humming softly against the floor. The sound blended seamlessly into the low background music piping through unseen speakers. Somewhere nearby, laughter erupted, sharp, sudden, then gone. Vegas laughter is like that. It flashes and disappears before it can mean anything. They weren't running from anything. That detail matters. There were no raised voices, no hurried glances over shoulders, no sense of urgency trailing them like a shadow. This was an escape. It was a stay, a booking made in advance, a confirmation email printed out and folded neatly into a pocket, the kind of small preparation that suggests intention, not desperation. The elevator ride was brief but quiet. Mirrors on 3 sides multiplied their reflections endlessly, turning 2 figures into dozens. For a moment, it was impossible to tell which version was real. The doors opened with a soft chime, and the hallway stretched out ahead, long carpeted, anonymous. Identical doors lined both sides, each one a promise or a secret, depending on who was standing in front of it. The room itself was unremarkable. That's the detail that lingers the longest. Beige walls, generic artwork framed in dark wood, a bedspread pattern just enough to hide stains, but not bold enough to be memorable. A window overlooking the city, where neon signs blinked even in daylight, rehearsing for the night to come. They set their things down. Shoes near the door, a jacket draped over the back of a chair, the quiet thud of a suitcase hitting the floor. These sounds, so small, so domestic, would later become unbearable to imagine, because every object left behind would eventually turn into a question. At some point, the door closed. Whether it clicked softly or shut with finality, no one can say. No one was listening closely enough to remember. Las Vegas thrives on arrivals. People flood in daily, carrying expectations heavier than their bags. Winning, forgetting, reinventing. But departures matter less here. People leave all the time. Sometimes early, sometimes without checking out, sometimes without anyone noticing at all. That first evening passed without record. No confirmed sightings. No surveillance footage that would later become significant. If they went downstairs, if they walked the strip, if they stood beneath the artificial sky of a casino's ceiling and watched time dissolve, those moments were never officially captured. They exist only as possibilities. What is known is what didn't happen. There were no frantic calls to the front desk, no noise complaints from neighboring rooms, no interruptions. The night folded itself neatly over the hotel like a blanket, and the city outside pulsed on, oblivious. Morning in Las Vegas arrives quietly. The sunlight feels out of place against glass towers and flickering signs. Housekeeping carts begin to roll, their wheels echoing down hallways with mechanical patience. Doors open, doors close. Rooms reset themselves for the next wave of guests. But one door stayed closed. At first, that meant nothing. Plenty of guests sleep late. Plenty of people request privacy. A do not disturb sign is a shield in a city that doesn't ask questions. Time stretched. Hours passed. The hallway breathed in and out with foot traffic and muffled conversation. Inside the room, everything remained exactly as it had been left. That fact would come later. What mattered in that moment was absence, not dramatic, not alarming, just slightly out of place, like a missing word in a sentence that still almost makes sense. Las Vegas doesn't react quickly to silence. It assumes you'll come back. It assumes you're busy. It assumes, above all else, that what's happening is intentional, that if you're gone, you meant to be. And so the city kept its rhythm. Cards shuffled, drinks poured, money changed hands. Outside the hotel, strangers brushed past one another under glowing signs, each convinced their own story was the one that mattered. Somewhere above it all, behind a door that no one opened, time stalled. Years later, people would try to pinpoint the exact moment everything went wrong. They would debate whether it was a check-in, the elevator ride, the closing of the door. They would search for a clear line between before and after, as if tragedy announces itself with structure. But the truth is quieter. The last confirmed moment of certainty was that front desk interaction. Names entered into a system. Keys issued. A transaction completed. From the hotel's perspective, the agreement was fulfilled. A room was provided. What happened inside it, or beyond it, slipped beyond the boundaries of responsibility almost immediately. Disappearance doesn't always feel like vanishing. Sometimes it feels like being misfiled, like a life placed in the wrong drawer and forgotten there. If anyone had been watching closely enough, they might have noticed how ordinary everything was, how unremarkable, how perfectly this moment blended into 1,000 others happening at the same time across the city. That's what made it possible. That's what made it last. Because in a place designed to overwhelm the senses, the quietest moments are the easiest to lose. Las Vegas is not a city that values permanence. It never has. From the beginning, it was designed to shimmer just long enough to convince you it would always be there, and then quietly replace itself while you weren't looking. Buildings rise with confidence and fall without ceremony. Names change. Facades are stripped away. What once felt iconic becomes outdated almost overnight. In this city, memory is not preserved, it is renovated. To understand how someone could vanish here, you have to understand what Las Vegas expects of the people who enter it. It doesn't ask who you were before. It doesn't demand consistency. You can arrive as one version of yourself and leave as another, or not leave at all, and the city will absorb that outcome without resistance. Reinvention is not a side effect here. It's infrastructure. The hotel they checked into was a product of this philosophy. When it first opened, it had been advertised as modern, efficient, forward-looking. Not glamorous in the way the Strip's giants were, but dependable. A place for people who wanted proximity without spectacle. Over the years, it aged quietly. Carpets dulled. Fixtures lost their shine. Newer, louder properties pulled attention away. The hotel didn't fail. It simply became invisible. In Las Vegas, invisibility is dangerous. The city trains everyone, staff, visitors, authorities alike, to normalize absence. Guests leave early to chase losses or winnings elsewhere. Rooms go unused because plans change. Names appear and disappear in reservation systems like fleeting thoughts. No one is surprised when someone does a return. This is a city where forgetting is practical. The scale alone encourages detachment. Tens of thousands of rooms. Millions of visitors. A constant turnover so rapid that faces blur into statistics. Even extraordinary events struggle to stand out for long. What chance does an unremarkable disappearance have against that kind of volume? What makes Las Vegas different from other cities isn't crime or corruption. It's emotional design. Everything here is built to keep you in the present moment. No clocks. No windows in casinos. Artificial skies that never change. Time becomes flexible, then irrelevant. When time loses structure, accountability often follows. The hotel was part of that ecosystem. Its hallways were long and uniform, intentionally disorienting. Rooms repeated themselves endlessly, as if individuality were an inconvenience. The architecture didn't invite curiosity. It discouraged it. You were meant to move through, not linger. Staff turnover was high. That, too, mattered. Faces at the front desk changed frequently. Housekeepers rotated floors. Managers came and went. Even if someone had noticed something unusual, the memory would have belonged to a person who might not be there the following month. Institutional memory eroded as quickly as personal memory. And then there was the paperwork. Las Vegas runs on systems, databases, ledgers, digital timestamps. But systems are only as attentive as the people maintaining them. In an era before everything was permanently archived, records could be overwritten, misplaced, or quietly discarded. A no-show, an extended stay, a room marked vacant. Each checkbox simplified reality into something easier to process. The city prefers clean endings, even when none exist. The idea of vanishing in Las Vegas has always carried a strange cultural romance. People talk about it casually, almost jokingly. If I ever disappear, check Vegas. As if the city itself is a plausible explanation. As if the lights are capable of swallowing a person whole. But behind that humor is an unsettling truth. Las Vegas makes disappearance feel believable. Here, losing track of someone doesn't immediately trigger alarm. It triggers assumptions. Maybe they found someone else. Maybe they left town. Maybe they didn't want to be found. Personal choice becomes a default explanation, even when evidence is thin. And that assumption creates a dangerous pause. The hotel sat just off the main artery of the Strip, close enough to feel connected, far enough to avoid scrutiny. It wasn't the kind of place journalists circled or tourists photographed. It existed to serve, not to be remembered. When newer developments rose around it, the hotel adapted just enough to survive, sealing off wings, reconfiguring spaces, quietly reshaping itself from the inside. Las Vegas is especially skilled at this kind of internal change. Walls move, rooms are merged or divided. Entire floors are closed for months or years. Guests rarely ask why. They assume construction is constant because here it is. That culture of acceptance, of noise, of disruption, of unanswered questions creates opportunity, not just for crime, but for oversight, for silence, for things that don't fit neatly into a report. The city doesn't slow down to investigate its own blind spots. Even law enforcement operates differently here. With so many visitors passing through, disappearances are often framed through the lens of transience. People come to Las Vegas intending to shed something, money, identity, responsibility. When they vanish, the assumption is that the shedding went further than expected. It's not cruelty, it's efficiency. But efficiency has a cost. It turns people into patterns. It prioritizes probability over individuality. And in doing so, it creates space for rare, catastrophic exceptions to go unnoticed. The hotel, by design, mirrored this mindset. It offered privacy without intimacy, comfort without connection. You could stay there for days and leave without anyone learning your habits, your routines, or your fears. That anonymity was marketed as freedom. It also made you fragile. Years later, when the building would be revisited with new eyes, people would struggle to reconcile how much had changed without anyone really noticing. How many times hallways had been repainted? How many walls had shifted by inches or feet? How many decisions had been made by people who never imagined they were altering the trajectory of a story? But at the time, none of that was visible. The city was too busy performing itself, too focused on the spectacle of now. Las Vegas doesn't conspire to make people disappear. It doesn't need to. It simply provides the conditions where disappearance doesn't feel urgent, where silence blends into background noise, where a closed door can remain closed, not because someone is guarding it, but because no one thinks to open it. In a city designed to forget yesterday as quickly as possible, the most dangerous thing you can be is unremarkable. And that's exactly what they were when they arrived. Morning did not arrive with urgency. It never does in hotels like this. It crept in slowly, filtered through heavy curtains and tinted glass, softening the edges of the room without revealing much of what lay beyond. Outside, the city was already awake. But inside the hotel, time moved on a different schedule, one dictated by checklists, carts, and routines repeated so often they no longer required thought. Housekeeping began its rounds just after sunrise. The rhythm was familiar. Knock, announce, wait. Knock, announce, wait. Most doors responded in predictable ways. A muffled voice asking for more time. A hand reaching out to take fresh towels. A door opening just wide enough to confirm life inside. The work depended on these small acknowledgments, these signals that the room was still occupied, still active, still part of the system. When the cart stopped outside their door, nothing felt unusual at first. The knock was gentle, practiced. Housekeeping. A pause followed, long enough to be polite, short enough to remain efficient. No answer. That happened often enough. Guests slept late. Guests ignored knocks. Guests didn't want to be disturbed. The handle wasn't tried. The cart rolled on. Hours passed. By late morning, the hallway had thinned. Checkout time came and went, marked not by an announcement, but by subtle shifts in behavior. Luggage appeared near doors. Elevators filled more quickly. Front desk phones rang with questions about storage in taxis and late fees. The hotel moved into its next phase without resistance. Their room remained unchanged in system. At the front desk, no one flagged it. There was no automatic alert for silence. The reservation showed an active stay. Payment details were valid. No complaints had been logged. From a procedural standpoint, everything was in order. A room in use doesn't require attention. This is how disappearances begin to settle into place. Not with chaos, but with administrative calm. Sometime after noon, housekeeping returned. The cart stopped again. The same knock. The same announcement. This time, the pause stretched longer. Silence pressed back from the other side of the door, dense and unyielding. Still, this wasn't alarming. Guests oversleep. Guests leave early and return late. Guests forget to hang signs. The hotel's logic favored patience over intrusion. The cart moved on once more. By mid-afternoon, something subtle shifted. It wasn't fear. It wasn't panic. It was irritation, a mild inconvenience, a room that couldn't be serviced yet, a delay in routine. These small disruptions register more clearly than absence itself. A supervisor was notified, not because someone was missing, but because a task remained incomplete. The knock came again, firmer this time, louder, more official. Still, no answer. When the door was finally opened, it wasn't with dread. It was with expectation. The room was quiet, too quiet, but only in hindsight would that distinction matter. The air felt stale, untouched by movement. Curtains were drawn partway, allowing a narrow stripe of light to cut across the carpet. Nothing appeared disturbed. Nothing appeared wrong. Beds were neatly made, not slept in. Luggage sat open, clothing folded with intention rather than haste. Personal items rested where hands had last placed them. A phone charger plugged into the wall and used. Shoes aligned near the door. A jacket draped carefully over a chair, as if waiting. The bathroom showed no signs of use. No damp towels. No fog mirror. The sink was dry. Absence is rarely dramatic. It reveals itself through what remains untouched. The supervisor stood in the doorway longer than necessary, scanning for context, for clues that would explain the stillness. Perhaps they'd stepped out briefly. Perhaps they were downstairs. Perhaps became the most important word in the room. Protocol didn't demand escalation yet. Guests were allowed to come and go freely. There was no checkout time violation, severe enough to justify alarm. No personal belongings were missing, which suggested return rather than departure. The door hadn't been locked from the outside in any unusual way. The room was closed again. At the front desk, a note was made. Minimal, neutral, room unresponsive. Check later. The city outside continued to churn. Neon signs flickered back to life as daylight softened into evening. Crowds swelled. Music spilled onto sidewalks. Inside the hotel, the night shift took over, inheriting the same quiet uncertainty without context or urgency. Phone calls were attempted. The number on file rang unanswered. Voicemail engaged. No message was left. Messages felt premature, intrusive. There was still time. By the next morning, the silence had aged. It no longer felt neutral. It felt wrong. Another knock. Another announcement. Another unanswered pause. This time, the door was open with caution rather than expectation. Nothing had changed. The room existed in a suspended state, as if frozen at the exact moment it had last been occupied. Dust had not yet settled heavily enough to betray the passage of time. The air was still. The city's noise seemed distant, muted, as if the walls themselves were absorbing sound. That's when the questions began. Not loud ones, not yet, but quiet internal ones. Why leave belongings behind? Why make no contact? Why no signs of return? The front desk supervisor called management. Management reviewed policy. Policy was vague. Las Vegas is accustomed to people walking away from things. Money, relationships, plans, but walking away from everything without taking anything with you introduces discomfort. Eventually, a report was filed. Not a missing persons report. Not yet. An incident log, a notation, something to document irregularity without defining it. Law enforcement would later describe this window, the space between first absence and formal concern, as the most critical. It's where momentum either builds or dissolves. In this case, it dissolved. By the time authorities were contacted, the framing had already solidified. Adults, voluntary stay, no signs of struggle, no immediate danger. They were missing, but not endangered. The language mattered. Officers walked the room, scanning for evidence without knowing what they were supposed to find. No blood, no forced entry, no signs of conflict. Just a life interrupted mid-thought. Questions were asked. When were they last seen? Who saw them? What were they wearing? Answers were thin. Shrugs, uncertainty, polite speculation. The city had already begun to explain the silence away. Perhaps they left through a different exit. Perhaps they met someone. Perhaps they changed plans. Perhaps they didn't want to be found. Each assumption made the absence feel smaller, more manageable. And so, the moment when everything could have turned, when urgency could have replaced patience, passed quietly. The door closed again. The room was sealed. The hallway returned to its rhythm. The hotel did what it was designed to do. It moved on. Somewhere in the machinery of Las Vegas, their disappearance was reduced to a line item, a file, a case number that would grow colder not because time passed, but because nothing disrupted it. The morning they were gone did not announce itself as the beginning of a mystery. It disguised itself as a delay. And by the time the delay was recognized for what it truly was, the city had already forgotten how to look back. By the time the case found its way into official hands, it had already been shaped by assumption, not malice, not indifference in the obvious sense, just a quiet confidence that nothing extraordinary had happened. In Las Vegas, extraordinary events announced themselves loudly. This had not. The first report was thin. Names, dates, a hotel address, a timeline padded with uncertainty. Officers noted the absence of forced entry, the lack of disturbance, the untouched belongings. These details meant to signal mystery, instead suggested choice. Adults, after all, are allowed to disappear. That unspoken principle hovered over the case from the beginning, guiding every decision that followed. There was no urgent press conference, no immediate canvassing of nearby businesses. Surveillance footage was not pulled in a rush, because there was no rush to justify it. Casinos recorded endlessly, but storage was not infinite, without a clear window of relevance. Footage aged out, overwritten by newer days, newer faces, newer losses and wins. The investigation did not stall. It simply never accelerated. Detectives approached the hotel staff with routine questions. Who checked them in? Who saw them last? The answers were fragmented, blurred by shift changes in time. One clerk remembered the reservation, but not the faces. Another recalled luggage, but couldn't describe it. Memory, when not anchored by significance, erodes quickly. Housekeeping described the room as normal. That word appeared more than once in reports. Normal bed, normal layout, normal absence of damage, normal silence. Normal became a shield against deeper inquiry. The missing persons file grew slowly, padded with administrative language. No known enemies, no known debts, no signs of emotional distress noted by staff. The city's usual suspects, organized crime, gambling disputes, sudden violence, were acknowledged and dismissed with equal efficiency. There was nothing to point toward them. Family members were contacted days later, not hours. When the calls came, they landed like blunt instruments. Shock gave way to disbelief, then to a frantic need for explanation that no one could provide. Questions flooded in faster than answers ever could. When did they leave? Who were they with? What room were they in? The answers, again, were incomplete. From the family's perspective, the investigation felt strangely distant, polite, procedural. Officers listened, took notes, promised updates. But urgency is something you can feel, and this lacked it. The case was categorized, labeled, and placed among others like it: disappearances without violence, without witnesses, without immediate threat. Las Vegas had seen this before. Follow-up efforts were restrained by logic that felt airtight on paper. Adults can travel freely. Adults can cut contact. Adults can start over. Without evidence to suggest coercion or harm, resources were allocated elsewhere. The city was busy, always busy. Days turned into weeks. Leads, such as they were, dissolved quickly. Credit cards showed no activity beyond the hotel. Phones went silent. No border crossings flagged. No hospital admissions matched their descriptions. Each negative result narrowed the scope rather than expanding it. The absence began to feel intentional by default. Detectives revisited the hotel once more, walking the same hallways, standing in the same room. The space offered nothing new. Walls were solid, windows intact, no hidden doors, no signs of struggle. The room behaved exactly as it should have. What investigators didn't yet understand was how deceptive normalcy can be. Files were updated. The case status shifted subtly, almost imperceptibly, from active to inactive, from priority to pending. Language softened. Time frames widened. The investigation entered a holding pattern that would become permanent. Families pushed back. They asked for more searches, more attention, more transparency. They were told gently that without new information, there was little more to be done. That phrase, little more to be done, settled heavily into the years that followed. The truth is, investigations don't usually end. They fade. In Las Vegas, fading is faster. Personnel changes compounded the problem. Detectives retired or transferred. New officers inherited old files without emotional context. Names became lines on paper, a case number, a summary paragraph. The original unease, the subtle wrongness of the situation, did not survive the handoffs. What remained were facts stripped of feeling. At no point did anyone suggest the hotel itself might hold answers beyond what was visible. Buildings are assumed to be passive. Background, container for events, not participants in them. Once the room was cleared and returned to use, it ceased to be evidence in any meaningful sense. Guests stayed there again, slept in the bed, opened the curtains, lived temporary lives inside a space that still held unanswered questions within its walls. The investigation's greatest failure wasn't negligence. It was imagination. No one imagined that the truth could be structural, that absence could be hidden not in records or memories, but in architecture, that the answer might not have left the building at all. As months turned into years, the case slipped further from relevance. New disappearances replaced old ones. New tragedies demanded attention. The city's constant churn ensured that yesterday's mysteries rarely competed with today's emergencies. For the families, time moved differently. Every unanswered call echoed. Every holiday sharpened the absence. They searched on their own, retracing steps, visiting the hotel, standing in the lobby where everything at last felt normal. The building offered no comfort. It had already moved on. Occasionally, a theory would surface, someone claiming a sighting, a rumor whispered online. Each spark was examined, then extinguished by reality. None held. None explained the silence. The official record remained unchanged. Years later, when journalists would review the case with fresh eyes, they would note how early assumptions guided every outcome, how the label voluntary disappearance shaped decisions long before it was proven, how the lack of visible violence became proof of safety rather than a question in itself. They would also know how the hotel, repeatedly renovated and altered, was never re-examined as a crime scene. Once it was cleared forever. By the time the investigation was effectively closed, no announcement marked the moment. No file stamped final. It simply stopped being discussed, stopped being revisited, stopped being remembered by the system meant to preserve it. The city absorbed the loss the way it absorbs everything else. quietly, efficiently, without ceremony. And somewhere behind those decisions, behind that calm procedural logic, the truth waited patiently, sealed away by confidence, routine, and the assumption that nothing extraordinary could hide in plain sight. For the people left behind, time did not soften the disappearance. It sharpened it. Every day without answers added weight rather than distance, pressing the absence deeper into their lives until it became something they carried everywhere. While Las Vegas continued its endless cycle of arrival and departure, their world stalled at a single unanswered question. At first, there was hope, not the abstract kind, but the practical version built from small expectations. A phone ringing unexpectedly, a voicemail left by mistake, a charge on a credit card in some unfamiliar city. Hope lived in routines. Checking messages first thing in the morning, refreshing inboxes late at night, scanning unfamiliar numbers with a quickening pulse. Each day felt like it might be the one where silence finally broke. Family members replayed their last conversations over and over, searching for hidden meanings. A casual comment suddenly felt loaded. A minor disagreement became unbearable in hindsight. Words that once passed unnoticed were dissected, rearranged, examined for warnings that no one had recognized at the time. Guilt settled in quietly. Why didn't I ask more questions? Why didn't I notice the tone of their voice? Why didn't I insist they call when they arrived? These questions didn't demand answers. They demanded punishment. And so the families punished themselves with endless what-ifs, convincing themselves that attentiveness might have altered fate. Personal spaces became archives. Bedrooms remained untouched. Closets stayed full. Small objects, receipts, notes, photographs took on new significance. A jacket smelled faintly like them. A handwriting sample became a relic. Time transformed ordinary belongings into evidence of existence. Birthdays passed awkwardly. Some families celebrated them anyway, refusing to let the date vanish along with the person. Others couldn't bear the reminder. Holidays fractured into before and after. Chairs remained empty, not symbolically, but physically, as if the body might still return to occupy them. Friends struggled to know how to respond. At first, they checked in often. They offered theories, reassurances, confidence. Over time, those conversations grew shorter, less frequent. Disappearances make people uncomfortable. There's no script for ongoing loss without closure. Eventually, even sympathy wears thin. The families noticed a shift and adjusted. They learned to speak about the disappearance in careful tones, to avoid burdening others with grief that never resolved. They learned which questions ended conversations and which phrases made people retreat. Loneliness took root in the quiet spaces between concern and forgetting. Some family members turned into investigators themselves. They retraced travel routes, called hotels, visited Las Vegas. Standing in a lobby where everything had unraveled, the city felt indifferent to their pain. It didn't recognize them. The hotel looked smaller than memory, more ordinary, as if daring them to find meaning in its walls. They asked staff questions that had already been asked years earlier. They received the same polite confusion. New employees had no knowledge of the incident. Management had changed. Records were archived or missing. The building itself offered no acknowledgement that anything had ever gone wrong. This absence of recognition was its own kind of cruelty. Media attention flickered briefly and then vanished. A short article, a segment that aired once and was never rerun. Without dramatic developments, the story failed to hold public attention. The families learned quickly that mystery without momentum is easy to ignore. They watched as other cases received headlines, updates, public pressure. They wondered what separated those stories from theirs. Violence? Youth? Visibility? They had none of it. Their loss was quiet. Their loved ones had vanished without spectacle. Over time, grief changed shape. The raw panic of the early days hardened into something more complex. A constant background ache. A permanent awareness of something missing. Not dead. Not alive. Just unresolved. This kind of grief doesn't offer milestones. There is no funeral. No grave to visit. No moment where mourning officially begins or ends. It exists in suspension, like the unanswered ringing of a phone. Relationships strained under the weight of it. Some family members disagreed about what might have happened. Arguments flared over theories, over optimism, over whether it was healthy to keep searching. Hope and acceptance became opposing forces, pulling people in different directions. Some clung to the belief that they would return, that they had chosen silence, that somewhere, somehow, they were alive and unable or unwilling to reach out. Others found that belief unbearable. They needed finality, even if it meant imagining the worst. Neither side was wrong. Both were suffering. Years passed. Life demanded movement. Children grew up. Careers advanced. New memories formed. But the disappearance remained a fixed point, unchanging. It didn't recede into the past. It followed them forward, shaping decisions in ways they didn't always recognize. Trust eroded. Travel felt dangerous. Silence felt threatening. Doors closing too quietly triggered unease. Las Vegas itself became a forbidden word in some households, spoken only when necessary. And yet, despite everything, the families refused to let the story vanish completely. They kept files. They kept copies of reports. They kept photographs ready in case someone, someday, asked. They lived in a state of readiness for answers. What they didn't know, what no one knew, was that the truth had not traveled far. It hadn't crossed state lines or adopted a new identity. It hadn't dissolved into the city the way everyone assumed. It was still there. While the families aged, while grief reshaped their lives, the hotel continued to stand, renovated, rebranded, reoccupied. Guests slept in rooms above and beside a space that held more than silence. The families felt time slipping away from them, witnesses aging, memories fading. Their fear wasn't just that the truth would never be known. It was that, even if it were, no one would still be listening. They had learned the hardest lesson of all. That disappearance doesn't just remove people. It isolates the living. And it does so quietly, patiently, waiting for the world to grow tired of asking where someone went. The hotel did not remain the same. Buildings rarely do, especially in Las Vegas. Change here is not dramatic. It is procedural. A permit filed, a wing closed, a renovation scheduled during low season. The transformation happens behind temporary walls and apologetic signage, while guests continue to come and go, unaware that the space around them is quietly being rewritten. Years after the disappearance, the hotel entered its first major phase of renovation. It wasn't framed as a rebirth, just an update. New carpets, modernized rooms, adjustments to improve flow and efficiency. The language of improvement masked the reality of alteration. Walls were moved, corridors shortened, storage rooms expanded into spaces that once held something else. Blueprints changed. The original architectural plans had already begun to fade into irrelevance. Copies were scattered across offices, outdated by years of incremental changes that were never fully consolidated. What existed on paper no longer perfectly matched what stood in concrete and drywall. That mismatch mattered more than anyone realized. Entire sections of the hotel were closed during renovations, sealed off from guest access. Doors were locked and labeled temporarily, but temporary in Las Vegas has a way of becoming permanent. Months stretched into years. Staff learned to navigate around blocked hallways without questioning why they were blocked in the first place. Human beings adapt quickly to altered environments. A closed door becomes invisible after enough time passes. Ownership changed hands. New management inherited an aging property with a complicated history they had no reason to study deeply. The disappearance was not part of the handover conversations. It wasn't highlighted in meetings. It existed, if at all, as a footnote buried in old records that no one was tasked with revisiting. With each transition, institutional memory thinned. The hotel's identity shifted as well. Marketing materials emphasized affordability, convenience, location. The building leaned into being unremarkable, a place people passed through rather than experienced. This anonymity protected it from scrutiny. No one asked questions about a hotel they barely noticed. Behind the scenes, maintenance crews dealt with practical problems. Pipes leaked, electrical systems aged, structural quirks emerged, odd measurements, inaccessible voids, spaces that didn't align with expectations. These anomalies were chalked up to old construction practices or previous renovations done cheaply or quickly. No one thought to connect them to a decades-old disappearance. When walls are open for renovation, workers expect surprises. Dead wiring, forgotten fixtures, evidence of past layouts. A city like Las Vegas is layered with its own history, built over and over again. Finding something unexpected isn't alarming, it's routine. And so, when certain areas proved difficult to access, when measurements didn't quite add up, it was treated as an inconvenience, not a mystery. Workarounds were implemented, plans adjusted, spaces sealed rather than explored. Sealing is often cheaper than understanding. The hotel developed pockets of inaccessibility, areas no longer used but not removed, behind false walls, beyond locked doors, above drop ceilings. These spaces were not hidden intentionally. They were simply left behind, casualties of progress and cost-cutting. Guests never noticed. They had no reason to. Staff learned the building's quirks through experience rather than documentation. New employees were trained by walking routes, not by studying blueprints. Don't go down that hall. That door doesn't open. Storage is on the other side now. Knowledge passed informally, stripped of origin or explanation. Over time, the building became a patchwork of decisions made by people who never expected those decisions to matter beyond the next quarter. Meanwhile, the disappearance receded further into the past. For most employees, it was unknown. For the building itself, it was embedded. Renovations continued intermittently. Each phase further distanced the present from the past. Walls thickened. Soundproofing added layers. Spaces once accessible became isolated. The hotel evolved into something its original architects would not have recognized. But architecture remembers, even when people do not. Years later, a new redevelopment plan was proposed, more ambitious than the rest. The city had changed. Competition intensified. The hotel needed a deeper overhaul to survive. This time, the plans involved structural reconfiguration, not cosmetic updates. Engineers studied the building closely. For the first time in decades, someone compared what was supposed to exist with what actually did. Discrepancies emerged. Measurements conflicted. Square footage didn't align. Certain load-bearing elements appeared where they shouldn't have been. These weren't immediately alarming, but they demanded explanation. Renovation at this scale required precision. Workers began opening spaces long sealed. Dust billowed from cavities that hadn't been exposed in years. Air that hadn't moved in decades escaped into hallways. Old materials, outdated insulation, forgotten fixtures came into view. The building began to give up pieces of itself. At this point, no one was thinking about the missing. The past had grown abstract, distant. The renovation was about the future, about viability, profit, relevance. The hotel was being prepared for another cycle of forgetting. Yet the more they opened, the more the building resisted simplification. Hidden voids appeared where none were expected. Walls that should have been exterior turned out to be internal. Spaces overlapped in ways that defied logic. These discoveries slowed the project. Questions were asked, not about history, but about safety and cost. Engineers revised plans. Contractors flagged areas for further inspection. The hotel, long compliant, began to feel like a puzzle. What no one realized yet was that the building wasn't hiding a flaw. It was preserving a story sealed not by intention, but by years of routine decisions made without curiosity, by a city that valued forward motion over reflection, by a culture that accepted closed doors as long as the light stayed on. The hotel had not stayed still. It had been moving all along, and in its movement, it had carried something with it, undisturbed, unacknowledged, waiting for the moment when progress would finally require looking back. When the story refused to end, people began to feel the silence themselves. That is what happens when answers don't arrive. Speculation steps in, wearing the confidence of certainty. Over the years, the disappearance became less a question and more collection theories, each one shaped by the fears and fascinations of time. Las Vegas encouraged this kind of thinking. It is a city already steeped in myth, where rumors travel faster than facts and coincidences are treated like clues. Organized crime was the first explanation people reached for. It fit the city's reputation, its cinematic history. The idea that the wrong conversation or the wrong wind could lead to sudden erasure felt believable, almost expected. But the details never aligned. There were no financial trails, no debts uncovered, no known associations with anyone powerful enough to make people vanish, without leaving ripples. Organized crime thrives on control, not randomness. This disappearance was too quiet, too unclaimed. Then came the idea of voluntary disappearance, that they had chosen to walk away from their lives, leaving everything behind by design. This theory appealed to a certain kind of logic, the kind that prefers autonomy over tragedy. Adults, after all, have the right to start over. But starting over usually leaves traces. Bank accounts, documents, sightings. Someone, somewhere, uses a name, makes a purchase, applies for something. Vanishing completely requires resources, planning, and intent that the evidence simply didn't support. Leaving personal belongings behind suggested interruption, not strategy. Still, the theory lingered because it was easier than confronting darker possibilities. Some believed they had fallen victim to a random act of violence, an encounter gone wrong outside the hotel. Las Vegas offers endless opportunities for chance meetings, some of them dangerous. But again, the absence of evidence worked against the idea. No witnesses, no recovered belongings, no body. Random violence leaves chaos. This left nothing. Others turned to more elaborate explanations. Secret passages, underground tunnels. The city's hidden infrastructure became a canvas for imagination. People spoke of forgotten service corridors, of basements and sublevels built during earlier eras and sealed over time. These ideas sounded fanciful, but they tapped into something real. Las Vegas is built in layers, and much of it is unseen. The problem was that no one could prove any of it. Online forums dissected the case with forensic enthusiasm. Timelines were reconstructed. Old photographs of the hotel were scrutinized for anomalies. Armchair investigators argued over details that had long since lost their original context. Each theory gained followers, then faded as contradictions emerged. What all these explanations had in common was their distance from the human cost. They turned the disappearance into a puzzle rather than a loss. A riddle to be solved, not a life interrupted. For the families, the speculation was both exhausting and painful. Each new theory reopened wounds. Each confident assertion felt like an intrusion. People spoke as if the missing were characters in a story rather than real individuals with unfinished lives. The families learned to brace themselves whenever the case resurfaced online. Hope rose and fell as theories promised resolution and delivered nothing. False certainty became its own kind of cruelty. Years passed, and the story settled into obscurity, resurfacing only when someone rediscovered it and briefly breathed life back into the speculation. The case became a footnote in lists of strangest disappearances, grouped with others that shared little beyond unresolved endings. What most people didn't realize was that every theory pointed outward, away from the hotel, away from the room, away from the idea that the answer might be mundane, unglamorous, and physically close. People want mysteries to be expansive. They want conspiracies, journeys, transformations. They want explanations that match the emotional weight of loss. They rarely want to believe that something simple was overlooked. Theories grew more certain as time passed, not less. Distance breeds confidence. With no new information to challenge them, speculation hardened into belief. People chose a version that felt most satisfying and stopped questioning it. That certainty became a barrier. It discouraged re-examination. It framed the case as solved in spirit, if not in fact. Organized crime, voluntary disappearance, tragic accident. Pick one, move on. Meanwhile, the building stood, unassuming, altered, quiet. The most persistent theories never considered it. Architecture is rarely granted agency. Walls are assumed to be static, honest, incapable of deception. The idea that a building could hold a secret for decades felt implausible, almost insulting to human intelligence. And yet, buildings outlast people. They witness without speaking. They preserve conditions long after context is lost. The speculation missed this because it was looking for intention. Someone choosing, someone acting, someone planning. What it wasn't looking for was neglect. Neglect is harder to dramatize. It doesn't feel like an answer. It doesn't offer a villain or a motive. It offers only a sequence of small decisions, each one reasonable on its own, combining into something irreversible. As the years accumulated, the theories became a substitute for truth. They filled the silence so completely that there seemed to be no room left for discovery. The case felt closed in spirit, if not in record. And so, when a hotel renovation years later uncovered inconsistencies, when measurements didn't align and spaces appeared where none should exist, no one connected it to the disappearance at first. The theories had trained everyone to look elsewhere. They had convinced the world that the answer was out there, moving, hidden, complex. Not still, not sealed, not waiting quietly behind a wall that no one had thought to question. The greatest trick the mystery ever played was allowing itself to be overexplained. In doing so, it ensured that the simplest possibility remained invisible until the building itself decided it was time to be heard. By the time the next renovation began, the hotel was no longer pretending it could survive on cosmetic fixes. The city around it had changed too much. New properties rose taller, brighter, louder. Competition was ruthless, and nostalgia no longer sold rooms. This redevelopment was meant to be decisive, a structural reset that would either save the building or finally erase it. Engineers arrived with tablets instead of clipboards. Digital models replaced old blueprints, overlaying theoretical layouts onto the physical structure. It was during this process that the first real problem emerged, not as a mystery, but as a technical error. The numbers didn't line up. Square footage was off by just enough to be irritating. Not enough to suggest fraud or collapse, but enough to stall progress. A few feet unaccounted for on one floor. A wall that extended farther than the model allowed. A corridor that should have intersected with another space, but didn't. At first, it was dismissed as a documentation issue. Older buildings are notorious for this. Decades of modifications rarely translate cleanly into modern systems. The solution, initially, was simple. Open the wall, verify, adjust. Opening walls is never dramatic at the start. It's dust and noise and routine frustration. Temporary barriers go up. Guests are rerouted. Workers suit up and begin dismantling drywall that hasn't been touched in years. Behind the first layer was nothing unusual. Wiring, insulation, the familiar clutter of a building's internal organs. But the measurements still didn't resolve. The discrepancy remained, stubborn and unexplained. Another wall was marked, then another. Each time, the expectation was resolution, and each time, the building refused to clarify itself. The void behind the walls didn't connect the way they should have. Some spaces ended abruptly. Others extended into darkness without purpose. This was no longer a simple renovation inconvenience. It was a structural anomaly. Work slowed. Meetings were called. Engineers debated whether past renovations had created dead zones, areas sealed off and forgotten. That explanation satisfied everyone for a while. It was plausible, cost-effective, common. Still, someone had to see it. A larger section of wall was opened, one that had clearly been part of an earlier layout. The dust that spilled out was thicker, heavier. The air smelled different. Old, undisturbed. Like something exhaled after holding its breath for a very long time. Lights were brought in. Flashlights cut into the darkness, revealing a narrow space that shouldn't have existed at all. It wasn't a room. Not exactly. More like a cavity. Too deliberate to be accidental. Too sealed to be accessed casually. The space didn't appear on any plan. At this stage, curiosity overtook routine. Work paused. Not because of danger, but because no one wanted to be the one who misunderstood what they were seeing. Measurements were taken again. Photos snapped. Someone joked about hidden rooms and urban legends, trying to lighten the mood. But no one laughed for long. The cavity extended farther than expected, partially concealed by an internal wall that had been reinforced at some point in the past. Reinforced in a way that suggested intention, not decay. This wasn't leftover space. It had been closed deliberately. Renovation supervisors face a choice. Seal it and move on, or escalate. Sealing would have been cheaper, faster, easier, and under different circumstances, it might have happened without hesitation. But this time, the project was already under scrutiny. Inspectors were involved. Engineers were accountable. Ignoring anomalies carried risk. The decision was made to open it fully. The wall came down slowly, carefully, as if the building itself might object. Dust filled the air again, coating everything in a fine gray film. The opening widened, revealing more of the space beyond. What lay behind it was not dramatic in the way stories prepare you for. There was no spectacle, no immediate shock, just the unmistakable sense that the space had not been meant to be seen again. The air inside was stale to the point of heaviness. Light revealed outlines first, shapes where shapes should not have been, objects placed rather than discarded. The quiet was absolute, swallowing the noise of construction site, just beyond the wall. Workers stepped back instinctively. This was no longer their domain. Authorities were contacted not with panic, but with formality. Protocol reasserted itself, as it always does when uncertainty crosses a certain threshold. The site was secured. Work stopped. Questions shifted from cost and schedule to origin and responsibility. As officials arrived, the building seemed to change tone. Or maybe it was the people inside it who did. Every hallway felt longer. Every closed door felt suspicious. The hotel, which had spent decades fading into the background, now demanded attention simply by existing. The space behind the wall was documented carefully. Photos, measurements, notes. Each detail added weight to the realization that something had been missed, not recently, but long ago. And with that realization came an uncomfortable question. How long had this been here? The answer, slowly emerging to material analysis and construction records, pointed backward through layers of renovation, past one ownership change, past another, back to a time when the hotel had been younger, when the disappearance was still recent, back to a moment when this wall was not just drywall and paint, but a decision. As investigators reviewed old maintenance logs and renovation permits, a pattern emerged. A period shortly after the disappearance. A rushed update. A wall added where none had existed before. No clear explanation for why. At the time, it would have seemed insignificant. A minor adjustment. A cost-saving measure. Something done quickly, quietly, without expectation of consequence. Now, it looked like the beginning of an answer. The hotel had not merely forgotten. It had been altered at exactly the wrong moment. As news of the discovery spread internally, a tension settled over the site. Workers spoke in hushed tones. Engineers revisited assumptions they had made without thinking. Management prepared for scrutiny they had never anticipated. Outside, the city continued as it always had. Tourists walked past the building without looking up. Traffic flowed. Lights blinked on and off, rehearsing their nightly performance. Inside, time folded back on itself. The renovation that was supposed to erase the past had instead exposed it, not through intention, not through investigation, but through necessity, through a need to make the building make sense again. And in doing so, it had opened a door that had been closed for decades. What lay beyond it would not just change the renovation plans. It would change the story entirely. What was revealed behind the wall did not arrive all at once. It emerged slowly in fragments, as if resisting translation into meaning. The first thing everyone noticed was how deliberately the space had been closed. This wasn't decay. It wasn't collapse. It was construction. The edges of the wall were clean where they shouldn't have been. The materials used matched the renovation era long past, not the original build. Someone had made a choice and then lived with it. Inside, the silence felt different. Not empty, contained. Sound behaved strangely there, dull and swallowed, as if the space had learned how to keep secrets. The air carried a faint, dry weight, the kind that comes from years without circulation. Time had not moved freely here. It had been trapped. The objects came next, not immediately identifiable as evidence. Just things. Belongings arranged without intention to hide, but without intention to be found either. Items that had once been part of daily life, now stripped of context. A shoe placed where someone might have stepped out of it briefly. Fabric folded, not packed. A bag resting against the wall, not positioned for travel. The arrangement suggested interruption. Nothing was scattered. Nothing suggested panic or haste. Whatever had happened here did not announce itself. It simply stopped. Investigators were careful with language from the beginning. They avoided conclusions. They spoke in conditionals and possibilities. But even restraint couldn't soften the implication forming in the room. This space was not storage. It was not architectural waste. It was a dead end. Material analysis began almost immediately. The layers of dust, the state of the objects, the construction methods used to seal the space, all pointed to the same era, the same narrow window of time, the same weeks following the disappearance. This wasn't coincidence. It was proximity. As more of the space was documented, the scale of the oversight became impossible to ignore. The cavity was large enough to occupy, small enough to disappear into, perfectly positioned between functional areas of the hotel, where sound would be masked and access limited. And once sealed, it would never be stumbled upon by chance. There was no need for malice for this to happen. No grand conspiracy. Only a sequence of small decisions made under pressure. Renovations done quickly. Walls added to solve problems no one expected to revisit. The assumption that what was sealed would remain irrelevant. The building had done what buildings do best. It kept what it was given. As authorities expanded the investigation, the past began to surface in uncomfortable ways. Old maintenance records were pulled. Renovation permits re-examined. A timeline assembled not around people, but around construction. The wall appeared shortly after the disappearance. No justification was documented. No follow-up inspection noted the space behind it. Someone had signed off on it. Someone had approved it. And then those people had moved on, changed jobs, retired, passed away. The decision had outlived its maker. When the discovery reached the families, it landed with a weight words could not carry. For decades, they had imagined distance, roads, borders, oceans. They had imagined their loved ones far away, beyond reach. The truth was closer, too close. The hotel they had stood in, pleading for answers. The walls they had passed without touching. The space they had never been allowed to see. All of it had been there, holding what they were searching for, while time took everything else. Grief shifted shape again. Not relief, not closure. Something heavier. The pain of knowing that the answer had never moved, while the world had told them it was gone. Public reaction followed quickly. Headlines leaned toward shock, but the deeper story unsettled people more than any dramatic phrasing could. This wasn't a tale of hidden villains or elaborate schemes. It was a story about systems failing quietly, about assumptions replacing curiosity, about how easy it is to wall something off and forget it exists. The space behind the wall became a mirror, reflecting collective discomfort. If this could happen here, in a functioning hotel, in a city that never sleeps, what else had been sealed away elsewhere? Investigators resisted sensationalism. They emphasized the absence of spectacle, the lack of obvious violence, the ordinariness of the setting. That ordinariness was the most disturbing element of all, because it meant this wasn't impossible. It was plausible. It had already happened. As the site was cleared and the space documented completely, the finality of the discovery settled in. The mystery that had stretched across decades collapsed inward, not with a bang, but with a quiet, irreversible click. The door had not been locked by intention. It had been closed by neglect. And neglect, once layered with time, can become indistinguishable from design. The hotel would eventually resume its renovation. Walls would be rebuilt, plans adjusted. But the space behind that wall would never be neutral again. It had crossed the boundary from structure to witness. The city would absorb the story, as it always does. But some stories resist absorption. They linger in the architecture, in the memory of those who finally know, and in the unsettling realization that the truth had not been hidden far away in darkness. It had been standing quietly in the middle of everything, waiting for someone to need the wall gone. Once the space behind the wall was fully documented, a different kind of investigation began. Not one focused on what happened inside that sealed cavity, but on how it had been possible at all. The question was no longer only about loss. It was about oversight, about systems, about the invisible chain of decisions that allowed something so significant to remain unnoticed for so long. There was no single moment to point to, no clear failure dramatic enough to carry blame on its own. Instead, there was a sequence of ordinary choices, each one reasonable in isolation. Together, they formed a perfect structure for disappearance. The hotel's early response had set the tone. The assumption that adults could leave voluntarily had delayed urgency. That delay shaped everything that followed. When time passed without visible danger, the need to look deeper softened. The room was cleared. The space was returned to use. The building resumed its purpose. Once that happened, the possibility that the hotel itself contained answers quietly disappeared from consideration. Investigators revisiting the timeline noticed how quickly the physical environment had been removed from suspicion. Architecture is often treated as static background, not as a variable. Once a room is checked and found undisturbed, it is mentally closed. Rarely does anyone consider that what appears solid might contain voids. The renovations that followed compounded this blindness. Each update altered the structure just enough to erase reference points. What had once been accessible became sealed. What had once been visible became hidden behind layers of improvement. And no one thought to look back. The city's pace played a role as well. Las Vegas does not encourage reflection. It rewards momentum. Projects move forward or they die. There's little incentive to pause and ask whether something unresolved might still matter. The disappearance became old news. Then it became no news at all. As investigators reconstructed the construction history, they saw how responsibility dissolved over time. Permits approved by one office. Work completed by contractors who followed instructions without context. Inspections focused on safety, not completeness. Each step passed accountability forward, thinning it until it was almost invisible. No one had intended to hide anything. That, in many ways, was the most unsettling conclusion. The wall had been built to solve a problem. Structural, logistical, financial. It had been added quickly, efficiently, and signed off by someone who had no reason to suspect its consequences. The space behind it had been left unaddressed because it was easier not to address it, and once sealed, it became conceptually unreachable. The investigation also revealed how much reliance is placed on records that assume accuracy. Blueprints were trusted. Logs were assumed complete. When they didn't match reality, the discrepancy was blamed on age, not on error. Trust replaced verification. Even law enforcement, bound by procedure, had been shaped by these same assumptions. Without evidence pointing inward, attention stayed outward. The absence of visible wrongdoing was treated as proof of safety rather than a reason for further scrutiny. This was not a failure of one department or one person. It was a failure of imagination within systems designed for efficiency. Families were invited to hear these findings, though no explanation could undo decades of loss. They listened as officials described process failures, documentation gaps, and structural oversights. None of it answered the emotional question they had carried for years. Why hadn't anyone looked harder? The answer was painful in its simplicity. Because nothing forced them to. The system did exactly what it was designed to do. Prioritize what was visible, measurable, and immediate. What fell outside those parameters faded into background noise. The building had complied. It had aged, adapted, and absorbed change without complaint. It had not demanded attention. It had not failed catastrophically. It had simply held onto what it was given. The investigation concluded with recommendations rather than accusations. Improved documentation. Better cross-referencing between renovations and unresolved incidents. Greater scrutiny of sealed or altered spaces. Changes meant to prevent repetition, not to assign guilt. There were no arrests to announce. No courtroom scenes. No dramatic reckoning. Just a quiet acknowledgement that something had been missed. Public response shifted from shock to discomfort. The story resisted easy framing. It wasn't about monsters or masterminds. It was about routine, about the danger of assuming that what we cannot see no longer exists. The hotel became a symbol not of evil, but of neglect layered with time. A reminder that buildings, like institutions, reflect the values of those who manage them. And when those values prioritize speed over reflection, silence over questions, the cost can be irreversible. As the investigation wrapped up, one realization settled heavily over everyone involved. The truth had not been hidden by darkness or distance. It had been hidden by confidence. Confidence in systems. Confidence in assumptions. Confidence that the ordinary could not conceal the extraordinary. The wall was gone now, the space exposed. But the lesson it revealed was harder to dismantle, because it asked an unsettling question, one that extended far beyond a single hotel in Las Vegas. How many answers have we sealed away simply because we believed we had already looked enough? Las Vegas did what it always does after a story surfaces. It absorbed it, reshaped it, and continued glowing. The lights never dimmed in response. The traffic never slowed. Tourists still posed for photos beneath signs promising fortune and transformation. From the outside, nothing about the city suggested it had just been forced to remember something it had tried very hard to forget. The hotel, too, carried on. Renovations resumed under new scrutiny. Walls were rebuilt with documentation this time. Measurements were triple-checked. Inspectors lingered longer than usual. But eventually, the dust settled, the barriers came down, and the building re-entered a rotation of places people slept without knowing where they were. Rooms were booked. Curtains were drawn. Doors closed softly behind new arrivals. Most of them never learned what had been found there. Stories like this don't end cleanly. They don't offer the satisfaction people expect from mysteries resolved. There was no dramatic confession, no single figure to blame, no final scene where grief transformed neatly into peace. What remained instead was something quieter and harder to carry. Knowing, for the families, knowing did not erase the years of uncertainty. It rearranged them. The decades spent imagining distance collapsed into a single location, a room, a wall, a few feet of space that had held everything they were searching for, while time kept moving forward without them. Some found a measure of stillness in that truth. Others found anger. Most found both, shifting unpredictably from one to the other. Closure is a word people use when they want grief to behave. Real grief rarely does. There were moments of unbearable clarity. Realizing how close they had been. Remembering standing in that building. Asking questions that were answered politely and incorrectly. Walking past walls that had already made their decision. The city had never meant to hurt them. That knowledge didn't make the pain lighter. Las Vegas never apologized either. Cities don't. They don't acknowledge harm the way people do. They continue existing, their purpose unchanged. They rely on scale to dilute responsibility, on movement to erase focus. But stories have a way of lingering even when places refuse to. This one settled into the spaces between myth and memory. It was retold quietly, without embellishment, because embellishment felt unnecessary. The truth was unsettling enough on its own. A disappearance not driven by malice or chaos, but by routine, by paperwork, by walls built to solve one problem and unintentionally preserve another. People wanted lessons. They always do. Warnings, rules, guarantees that this could never happen again. Investigations produce recommendations, checklists, reforms. They offer reassurance through process. Yet everyone who looked closely understood something uncomfortable. No system can fully protect against forgetting. Not when forgetting is efficient. Not when forgetting is rewarded. Not when moving forward is valued more than looking back. The hotel became a quiet symbol of that truth. Not infamous. Not haunted in the way stories usually mean it. Just altered. Its walls now carried a weight invisible to guests, but unmistakable to those who knew. Some nights, staff reported feeling unsettled in ways they couldn't explain. A sense of presence without form. Not fear, just awareness. The building had been changed by recognition. Once a secret is acknowledged, it doesn't disappear again. It stays embedded in the space. The city eventually stopped talking about it. Headlines faded. New stories took its place. Las Vegas thrives on novelty, and yesterday's revelation quickly became background noise. But for those who had followed the case closely, the silence afterward felt different from before. Heavier, because now the absence had a shape. There was a room that could be pointed to, a place where time had folded inward and waited. The idea that answers can remain physically present while emotionally unreachable, unsettled people in ways they struggled to articulate. It challenged a comforting belief that if something is close enough, someone will notice. This story proved otherwise. It proved that proximity does not guarantee awareness, that being surrounded by people does not prevent disappearance, that walls do more than divide spaces. They divide attention. Las Vegas, with all its light and sound, had provided the perfect cover not for violence, but for neglect, for the slow erosion of curiosity, for the assumption that what is unseen must be unimportant. In the end, the city did not change because of this story. People did. Some began to look at buildings differently, at closed doors, at renovation signs, at spaces marked restricted without explanation. They wondered what histories lay sealed behind efficiency. Others felt a quieter shift, a reluctance to assume that silence means choice, that absence means intention, a recognition that sometimes nothing dramatic happens at all. Sometimes a story ends because no one asked the right question soon enough. The hotel still stands, in some form, beneath the same desert sky. Its walls are newer now. Its layout makes more sense. Its past is no longer entirely hidden, but it is not advertised either. It exists in a way many places do after something irreversible has happened. Functional, ordinary, carrying a memory it did not choose. At night, the lights of Las Vegas reflect off its windows, blurring interior and exterior into a single glow. From a distance, it looks like every other building in the city, designed to overwhelm distinction. Up close, it feels different. Not because of what it contains, but because of what it once held and how long it held it without anyone noticing. This story does not end with justice in the traditional sense. It ends with awareness, with the unsettling understanding that answers are not always hidden far away, guarded by complexity or intent. Sometimes they are built over. Sometimes they are signed off on. Sometimes they wait patiently behind a wall, while the world convinces itself it has already moved on. Las Vegas will keep shining. People will keep arriving, believing their stories begin when they check in. But somewhere in the architecture of the city, this one remains, quiet, unresolved in spirit of non-fact, a reminder that disappearance doesn't always mean gone. Sometimes it means left behind.